Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, taking care of business on Canada's podcast network. Joining me today is Trevor Lui, co-founder of Quell and one of the business experts on the Empower with GoDaddy initiative with Futurpreneur. Thanks for joining us today, Trevor.
Thanks for having me on, Mario.
Well, let me ask you, first of all, just about the initiative, Empower, what it is and what your role is with it.
Empower by GoDaddy is a series of curriculums and workshops to assist and help up-and-coming or young entrepreneurs. My role recently has been as an ambassador, so doing some work with them on certainly assisting with, letting people know that this exists because there are a tremendous amount of workshops that are held throughout the year across online. And to sort of put a face to the life of being an entrepreneur, particularly in these last few years with what we've had to struggle with.
All right, and tell me just a little bit while we're at it, being an entrepreneur yourself, what Quell is and what you do.
Quell is one of our companies under umbrella of the Highbell Group. The Highbell Group really is our sort of our umbrella company. And I started off in the restaurant business, and that essentially just multiplied in terms of how business changed over the last few years. And, with COVID happening, I think a lot of us threw a lot of things on the wall and waited to see what stuck. And so what's left today are the things that actually stick. So we have 3 restaurant brands. We have a consumer product arm. We have events as another one, and then probably one of the most proudest ones that we have is a COVID baby that we started is Quell, which is our agency. And our agency has spent the last 2 years, number one, representing 15 talent across the country and doing very strategic consultative work for large businesses, government bodies, et cetera, around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay, wonderful. Tell me, let's take a look at these past two plus years. It's, obviously in a few months, it's coming on to 3 years. What's been the impact that you've seen out there on entrepreneurs of this period of time that we've gone through?
I think, did I lose you there for a second, Mario? Sorry.
No, we're all there.
For a second, it went dark for a second. Okay. Listen, I think we don't even need to categorize what the pandemic did for many people. I left corporate in 2018 after working 25 years in corporate to start my own business, of which I thought that I was on a pretty strong trajectory after 18 months, 2 years. We had good growth. But at the age of 45, I wasn't a spring chicken entrepreneur. So I'm trying to take everything that I adapted through being executive in corporate to start my own business. And then March 2020 happened. And I was considered an entrepreneur. I was self-employed. It left a lasting mark today that still sort of resonates in terms of how we deal with our business. In many aspects, the way I look at it is that it was, in many aspects, an aha moment and a light bulb moment to really sort of humble us in terms of how we had our business. But I thought my business was built great until pandemic hit, and I realized that it wasn't. And so 2020 came. As an entrepreneur, I was still learning to do a lot of things, learning to hire the right accountant, learning to hire the right, lawyers, learning the web side of things, which pre-2020, it existed, but we didn't have a reliance like the way we thought we would when 2020 hit in the pandemic, when everything shut down. And as a restaurant and hospitality owner, we went through the most lockdowns of anyone in the world. We had 5 lockdowns. It wasn't that long ago. We just reopened this May 2022. It feels like it was 3 years ago, but we just reopened in May of this year.
Yeah.
So for me, one of the biggest lasting impressions was, how do we utilize something like the pandemic, which taught us a lot of specifically of where we were weak and we were vulnerable, to sort of insulate us from that again? And what are things that we see for the future that are going to stay that we have to adopt to our businesses?
Yeah. Do you think as an entrepreneur, I recall years ago, there was, I'm based in Calgary, there was the recession, and a videographer did a series of mini clips with people talking about recessions and dealing with the recession, etc. But one of the things that struck my mind was this old oil guy, one of the pillars of the oil community here in Calgary, Jim Gray, and he said sometimes recessions are good because they force businesses to look at what they're doing and streamline their operations and look at better ways of doing things, because when the money is flowing, you can do whatever you want, right? And it doesn't really matter. What are your thoughts? Do you think the pandemic has taught business in general the same sort of lessons about how to look at their businesses, and maybe that they should be looking at their businesses to get them more efficient and streamlined?
Yeah, I think certainly businesses that thought they were impervious to maybe even just recessions. I mean, a recession is one thing, right?
Yeah.
A pandemic is completely different. I mean, I can say this as an operator. I find it a little more painful right now post-pandemic than it was in some aspects during the pandemic.
Yeah.
I think during the pandemic, all things equal, we were all going through the same thing,
Yeah.
right? When lockdown, there was a lockdown. When we couldn't do things, we couldn't do things. So no one had any level of extra advantage of how they were operating if we were all doing the same things. I think now, as we come through it, we're only starting to feel the effects of what we lost during the pandemic. We've seen that certainly with the labor crisis. We've seen that certainly with those that have not been able to adapt to a new way of business, right? If you think about it, Mario, do you remember 5 years ago when they tried to introduce the QR code
Oh yeah.
and no one would adopt it and no one would use it? Now we are QR crazy,
Yep.
right? I don't think that's going away. And so a lot of these things was, how do we insulate our businesses? How do we insulate our staff? How do we take a look at our pipeline of cash, right? And how our banks can support us. And one of the things that I really learned that the pandemic really forcefully pushed me into was how to utilize an online presence, because we were not able to be in person. In fact, look right now.
Yep.
I mean, I think about pre-pandemic, how little we were doing these types of meetings, right? We were reluctant to still do them. I never did them. I had maybe two Zooms a year. We went from 2 Zooms a year to 5 a day.
I have, yeah, exactly the same thing, 2 a day for me. Yeah.
Right. So, even in terms of how we were able to adapt to ourselves to make sure that this screen looked okay from your lens and that our background was okay, like little things like that. A lot of us didn't know how to do that stuff.
But you think, you use the word adapt, and I know I hate the term pivot, and it's something that was used quite a lot in the last 2 years. But the pandemic, or even recession, or any kind of economic downturn, that forces businesses to adapt, doesn't it? And I guess if you don't adapt as an entrepreneur, you're done, right? You fail.
We're seeing a record clip of small businesses close. It's no secret that after 5 rate hikes, and we've got another one teed up, that we are already seeing the effect of how the consumer spend culture has changed. We take a look at even how we're selling things, because we see a lot of, listen, there's still people that are spending money, but I think it's cyclical. I think those with money will always continue to spend a certain way. So those people will not go. Maybe that percentage of the demographic is shrinking a little bit. I think those with less, I think that demographic is growing, and I think we're seeing middle class shrinking. And so we see that in consumer spend just on how people are buying products. And we're in the food business. We see that on the food side. Now on the agency side, we're seeing a little trickle down effect on that as well, because people are like, okay, we're ready to finish our marketing dollars that we've got budgeted for 2022. we're going to just slow down a little bit when it comes to 2023 because we're not quite sure what's going to happen next year.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think it takes to be an entrepreneur? What kind of qualities, personality make for a successful entrepreneur?
I think one of the biggest things is to be able to have the ability to understand that failure is absolutely part of the process. That is one, because if you don't learn to adapt to fail, you will not succeed as being an entrepreneur. Because the one thing you do is you look to your left, you look to the right. There's really no one else to help you. You have to be able to be someone who can do or learn, at least in the beginning, to do everything.
Yeah.
Right. I went from being an executive and having over 200 staff and 12 department heads to I was my stamp licker, I was my courier, my accountant, my bookkeeper, my delivery. When I reopened my first reopened one of my restaurants during the height of the pandemic, I did it all by myself. I actually went to the grocers to buy my stuff because people still weren't shipping things. And I had to learn online how to create timed, spaced out pickups for customers, because back then we had to stay 6 feet apart and no one could be close to each other in the same space, and chopping my own food. Like, I had to do it all. And I had to really quickly adapt. So part of this is like the ability to be a chameleon and adapt is really until the point where you're like, there'll be a point where you hit a growth spurt where you're going to be like, I don't have enough time to do this. And sometimes you have to understand that you need to spend a little bit of money to make money.
Yeah.
Right. And that's something that I've adapted is like, I'm not a lawyer and I don't profess to be a lawyer. I need to hire a really good lawyer for my paperwork. Same on the bookkeeping and the accounting. So like, I'm starting to learn to adapt. I finally hired a payroll person because I can't do payroll by myself. So there are pain thresholds and pinch points with growth, because you always look at your bottom line and say, I'm growing, but there's actually not money coming into the bank because you're putting everything back into the business. And I always say, at some point you hit a nut when you put money back into the business. Once you hit that threshold, some of it starts to drop to the bottom line if you know how to use your resources properly.
Yeah, I liked your comments regarding failure, because I often find there's an analogy there with sports, right? And because no matter how good of a team you are, you can't win all the time, right? And I know that a lot of successful entrepreneurs and business people have that sports background, and they've learned that, as well as things like discipline and hard work and all that type of stuff. But yeah.
I look at, I'm a huge basketball fan. So I look at the Toronto Raptors. I've been a fan since they started in 95. And like the year before they won the championship in 2019, they had lost in the playoffs, deep in the playoffs, 3 years in a row.
Yeah.
And each year they lost differently. And for many of us who understood what they went through, they had to learn to lose all those times in order to learn how to win, right? The pain that you gain, and I tell you, I think for most of us through the pandemic, we had a lifetime of grief, an 18-month period to last us an entire lifetime. And so I carry that with me almost every day. Those lessons that I've learned, like it's almost a little bit of PTSD, that if I'm going to do something that reminds me of what happened during the pandemic, I think twice before I do it.
Yeah. One last thing, Trevor, when you look at all the challenges that are out there, whether it's a recession, whether it's the pandemic we've gone through, rising costs, inflation, et cetera, are you crazy? Are people crazy to be entrepreneurs in this day and age?
I think everything is cyclical. I think some of the most successful companies were built, on the edge of, if you think about the roaring 20s, right, out of the Depression. I think there's success to be found if you're a hard worker. One of the elements that I think people need to look at is also, and this is something that I have to learn, is we have to be able to seek help where there's help when we're not used to it. A lot of entrepreneurs are A-type personalities who don't like to listen to people. the one thing I find about this program by, GoDaddy, the Empower program, is this stuff is all free. And I wish that I would have latched on to something like this a lot earlier, because I didn't know how to build a website. I didn't know how to watch my algorithms or build, my merchant site. There's tools like this, among other things out there, that really help us as an entrepreneur. I don't think there's ever a good time or a bad time. I think if your business is right and you've got the right mindset, go for it, right? Just go for it. There's always going to be something in the way that we have to navigate.
Yeah, that's true. Well, thanks very much, Trevor, for joining us today.
Thank you, Mario, for having me. Hope you a wonderful holiday. And for anyone who wants, and by the way, if anyone who wants to sign up for one of these workshops, there are series that are coming on tomorrow as well. So make sure you go to really quickly. I think I have a website here because I really want people to use these tools. Futurpreneur.ca, my online business. I want to wish you a really happy holiday, Mario.
Well, same to you, Trevor. Thanks very much. That was Trevor Lui, who is co-founder of Quell and one of the business experts involved with Empower by GoDaddy with Future Entrepreneur. I'm Mario Toneguzzi, taking care of business on Canada's podcast network. Thanks for joining us today.